How do you make sense of the shape of a life? Starting with Mother's Day and Father's Day, summer often becomes, at least for me, a time of thinking over the mystery of what becomes of our lives, the twists and turns, the good luck, the bad luck, how it is that a life sets out in one direction and finds itself going amazingly in other, sometimes better, sometimes worse directions than we had imagined. The poet and novelist Robert Penn Warren, a hero of mine, once wrote a memoir reflecting on the shape of his father's life. His father had always dreamed of being a poet, but his life was forced in other directions, having to take over the family farm as a teenager, having to take on a business that fell apart during the Depression, and during the death of his wife that devastated him. Instead of progressing in his life, he became an unhappy recluse. But Warren wrote that in his later years, his father began to open up, and the two of them developed a profound, deep relationship. And Warren remembers one day sitting with his father as they were outside, sort of looking out at the expanse beyond, and his father's eyes seemed to grow vacant, not looking at anything in particular. And then out of the silence came just the simple statement, "I have lived a very happy life," out of nowhere. What makes for a happy life? Warren's father's story has a familiar ring because it describes a life that never quite became what he dreamed it would be, never quite was what he had hoped. His life was a story of joy and disappointment, of gratefulness and sadness. His life was hemmed in by limits, the kind of limits that come into absolutely everyone's lives. But somehow within them, he found his way to being able to declare, "I have lived a happy life." Many of you probably didn't pay too close attention to the words of the psalm that we sang together with the choir earlier. If you wanted to flip your way over to it, you could. Psalm 1, we have a psalm every week. Psalm 1 is the first psalm in the longest book of the Bible, the set of songs and poems we pray and sing about our faith. It's the foundation of Jewish spirituality, Christian spirituality, and it all opens with this very short psalm. Very simple, deceptively simple, you might say, where to begin everything and a whole set of poems that are going to be filled with joy and gladness and rage and sadness, it begins with a philosophical calm. Happy are those whose delight is in the law of the Lord. They are like trees planted by streams of water, bearing fruit in due season. Happiness comes in a particular way here. Happy are those whose delight is in the law of the Lord. It doesn't say, happy are those who succeed in their lives, who fulfill their dreams in their lives, who end up with a perfect career and an ideal family in their lives. No. Happy are those whose lives are planted in the soil of God's love and God's purposes. What a strange notion this is for so many of us, that we find our fulfillment by delighting in and trusting in God's way, God's teaching, and in the way God has ordered the world to be lived and us to be human. Plant yourself in God, this psalm says. Experience God's love and strength, and you will find a happiness and a peace even amidst the disappointments of a lifetime. The Jewish people, in fact, saw the law and these songs as Torah, as the word, a precious gift given from God so that they could find a way to the life of happiness by living in the ways that God had given them to live. I remember some time ago driving through the countryside and having my eye caught by a great twisted tree out in the middle of a field. It must have been a pasture because it was just grass around, but this great twisted tree, an oak or an elm. It was gnarled and bent, one great limb running almost parallel to the ground, looking like the tree had been blasted by some fierce storm. Yet still it was broad and wide and magnificent to look at. And I was struck then by how different this tree was from the tree it set out to be when it came up out of the ground. It became something entirely unimaginable. And my thoughts began to drift to people I've known whose lives ended up twisted in ways they never could have imagined, and yet whose lives possess their own strange grace and beauty. Limits shape our lives. That seems to be the way it works. Most of us begin our lives with hopes and dreams, but then we find them being shortened and moved and shifted as we live our lives, and the limits of our lives close in. And we find ourselves exposed to disappointment and confusion about where was my life going and where is it now. The challenge for us can be to accept the limits, the disappointment, and remain rooted in a God of hope and persistence. A great violinist, Yo-Yo Ma, accepts the limits of 4 strings and a bow, and by giving himself to them over a lifetime, has been able to create unimaginably beautiful music. In one way or another, I've heard people say to me, sometimes in joy, sometimes in sadness, I never dreamed that I would be doing what I'm doing now, living where I'm living now. This was never what I expected. I remember one businessman in these hard economic times marveling that he used to be the one who was running that large office, and now he's on the other end of the cell phone trying to get an appointment with anybody in an office like that who would be willing to talk to him about maybe finding a job. Limits handed to us. Our psalm doesn't provide recipes for success for getting around the limits at all. There are no maps for navigating this economy or making our way through the tragic loss of someone we love. But this psalm does something different. It coaches us on how to live fruitfully and courageously, no matter what we encounter. The psalmist contrasts the way of the happy who have planted themselves in God and the way of the wicked. The wicked aren't bad people. It says they are like chaff, leftovers when the grain is threshed, which blows away in the wind. Wickedness doesn't mean they're being willfully evil at all, but they are the ones who are rootless, who are determined to be self-sufficient, autonomous, doing what suits them, fighting for life on their own. These are the ones, the psalm says, who will never know happiness, because lives of isolated, individualistic, self-absorbed people thinking only of their wants do not produce grounded, wise, gracious people. We need, the psalm says, to be rooted, patient, willing to allow new fruit to grow in our lives. No one has demonstrated this more movingly, at least to me, than the short story writer Flannery O'Connor. One of her finest works is her collection of letters she wrote over her brief life. It's called The Habits of Being, where we see a Christian spirit facing the absolute limits of her own life. At the age of 25, O'Connor learned she had the debilitating disease of lupus, a particularly virulent kind, and that had already killed her father. And for the next 14 years, she grew increasingly incapacitated, and she died at 39. She had begun a brilliant literary career with close friends such as Boston's own poet Robert Lowell, but her illness forced her to leave the Northeast, where she wanted to be, and go back to live with her mother on a tiny farm in southern Georgia, and as it ends up, to spend the rest of her life there. It was a crushing disappointment. But her letters show amazing humor and patience and deep faith, those things that so characterized who she was. She accepted with grace the strain of living with a difficult mother. In one letter she wrote, "I come from a family where the only emotion respectable to show is irritation. In some, this tendency produces hives. In others, literature. In me, both." And when someone asked her why her stories were so harsh, she wrote, "Your great natural grace is finding the good in people. It's a real gift. I've never been troubled with it myself." But she had to face the fact that some things would never be. One woman wrote to her noting that there was no description of love in her stories at all. And O'Connor wrote back, "I agree, you can't write about love when you haven't had it, leastwise the romantic kind she was talking about. I never had any." And in another letter, she talked about her need to be with people. "My father needed the people and got them, or rather wanted them and got them. I wanted them and didn't. We are all rather blessed in our deprivations if we let ourselves be, I suppose." But her greatest struggle was with the disease that was to kill her. She showed amazingly little self-pity or anger, but every now and then the pain would show through. She wrote in one of her letters, "I can, with one eye squinted, take it all as a blessing. What you have to measure out, you come to observe closer, or so I tell myself." She believed, though, that she could learn from her illness. "I have never been anywhere but sick," she wrote. "In a sense, sickness is a place more instructive than a long trip to Europe. And it's always a place where there's no company, where nobody can follow. Sickness before death is a very appropriate thing, and I think those who don't have it miss out on one of God's mercies." Of course, living lives that are rooted and planted doesn't just happen. Those who were called happy in Psalm 1 are called to meditate on God's law day and night. That may sound a little ambitious to you, but we should acknowledge that we spent a whole year just now meditating on God's word and law together. So let's give us at least some credit. And the good news is that our Christian formation program for next year is focusing on helping those of us who made that journey through those Holy Scriptures to begin living them practically. We together will explore what it means to be planted, rooted, grounded in God. All the good academic work of last year was the foundation so we can start living as planted, rooted human beings, grounded in God's love. I have lived a happy life. To be able to say that amidst all the twists and turns of all our lives calls for an act of great trust and also acceptance. The shape of our lives is a mystery, but at the heart of it all is God. So let me close with the words of an Irish popular song of some years ago that sums up very simply what it seems to me this journey of planting is all about. "One day at a time, sweet Jesus, that's all I'm asking from you. Give me strength to do each day what I have to do. Yesterday is gone, sweet Jesus, and tomorrow may never be mine. Lord, help me today. Show me the way, one day at a time." One day at a time, rooted and planted. That's our way.